All right, we're talking about selecting your instructional objectives. And it's important that when you go out to the curriculum framework document and you pick out the specific student learning expectation that you want to teach, it is often written in language that students will not care to understand or understand. It's got a lot of educational jargon in it most of the time. Sometimes they've actually been written in a very student-friendly manner. But most likely you'll have to trim because perhaps the student learning expectation gives more learning than can be taught in a single lesson, kind of like the driver's ed version. When you convert that framework down to your more clear student-friendly version, you want to make sure that it has these qualities. So let's talk about these and let's practice putting them into action. Clear, friendly language, specific, framework-based, and measurable. Before we move on, I want to talk to you a little bit about what's called alignment. It's a word that you're going to hear me use a lot tonight. As you plan a lesson, it's important that you're always trying to make sure that you keep everything well aligned. And what are the pieces that go in these other boxes? Well, let's talk about the driver's education lesson. Once we know what we're going to teach, road signs, and we have 10 road signs we want students to learn and explain, we would be very wise if the next thing we do is to actually write the assessment. I don't mean just think about the assessment. Literally write out the assessment the students will take at the end of that lesson. What exactly is it that we want them to be able to do? If we look back at the student framework that we wrote for that lesson, I'll just tell you what it said. Students will be able to identify and explain 10 road signs. All right, I think we put common road signs in there. So that's the kind of assessment that we need to build. So we might decide, I think for our lesson, we're going to actually use a written quiz at the end. Sometimes teachers will call this an exit ticket. It's the thing you have to do to basically get out the door and be done with the lesson. And the exit ticket will test your understanding of, the objectives. If you pick out your student learning expectation and then write your assessment second, that way, pretty much here's where students are going to start, and here's where I want them to end up. And what's going to come in between, that's when you plan the lesson activities, the assignments, the things that we're going to do. How will I teach it? What will I ask students to do? What kind of assignments will be given to these students? And this is pretty much how will they get from point A to point B? It's through these. The only reason I'm emphasizing to the order is it's common for people to teach to a plan like this. Pick out the instructional outcome or the objective, plan the activities and assignments, and then plan the assessment. It is smarter to do what's called more of a backwards design, which means I know what I'm going to teach. Now I'm going to plan the end product, the assessment, and then I'm going to backwards plan these activities. In other words, when it comes to picking out what they're actually going to do during the lesson, it would be very wise of me to be thinking about the assessment the whole time, because this is the end point. What kinds of things should I ask them to do to help them to get to the assessment and be able to do it successfully? So you may hear teachers talk about backwards design. That's what they're talking about. First, second, third in your planning. When it comes to writing the objective, that means I have the framework that I pull from the documents, the state documents, and now I want to turn this into an objective. Here are some that we want you to avoid. Something like students will know. The problem with students will know is that the problem is the verb know. It is not very measurable. Students will know the 10 road signs. Well, how will they know them? What will these people do to show that they know? That's the missing piece. Another one that's a problem is students will understand. Again, or students will demonstrate an understanding of. Unless it's a physical skill, demonstrate is difficult. Like if I was teaching PE and I wanted them to demonstrate their ability to throw a ball, that's something they're physically going to do. But demonstrating an understanding of 10 road signs, think about that. Students will understand 10 road signs. Well, what does it mean to understand? What will they do to show their understanding? Students will demonstrate their understanding of 10 road signs. I still don't know what they're doing to show that they understand. Students will demonstrate knowledge of 10 road signs. It sounds really, really smart, but it doesn't mean much. I still do not know how you're demonstrating your knowledge of the 10 road signs. Or something just like students will learn 10 road signs. And that really doesn't tell me how they'll be assessed. What's missing on all of these is the measurable quality. You want to write measurable objectives. You may be thinking, well, how would you write it? And I'll just remind you of what we had in our plan. In fact, I'll just show it to you. Our lesson for driver's education, we use students will identify and explain 10 common traffic signs. So the difference is the verbs. We used identify and we used explain. Those are measurable. I can imagine what I would ask kids to do. I can kind of tell you what that assessment would look like. They would see a sign and they'd have to tell what it's called, and then have to explain it in their own words. So I'm not using any of these pieces that we want you to avoid, like know and understand or demonstrate knowledge of or learn. So watch out for your tendency maybe to use these. So where do you come up with all these measurable verbs? I mean, how am I supposed to pull these out of my head? Well, one of the things that you can rely on is called Bloom's taxonomy. Benjamin Bloom is another one of our researchers or theorists, and he's credited for creating these 3 domains of pretty much it's a taxonomy of mental skills, growth in feelings and emotions, or manual or physical skills. So this little diagram shows the affective domain, which is the one that has to do with growth in feelings or emotions, the psychomotor domain, which has to do with the manual or physical skills. It's the cognitive domain that we want to focus on right now. And the reason we have this original and the new domain is because a few years ago, the original Bloom's taxonomy was revised and this new version was created. And so you want to know the new domain and use the new domain words, and watch out for websites that might be using the original domain, and make sure that you update them, because people now are really using this terminology instead of the old terminology. Now, this next slide really breaks it down for you and explains the different levels. And just quickly, what's happening here is Bloom knew that some tasks we ask students to do are more difficult than other tasks. So as a teacher, you use Bloom's taxonomy to help you plan lessons so that you can stretch students' thinking over time. So the reason that the number 1 has number 1 next to it does not mean it's the top level of thinking. In fact, it's the bottom. So the least difficult kind of thinking that you might ask students to do is just purely a remembering task. In other words, memorize. And for example, with the 10 road signs, if we taught those and we just said, hey, everybody, just memorize the 10 signs tonight, come back tomorrow, we're going to take a test. I'll show you the sign, you'll name the sign, you'll just memorize these explanations, and you'll just write out your memorized explanations again. Then, we all have had classes like that where pretty much you just had to remember the basics and you had to come back and spit it back out on the test and you got your A. That does not require a huge amount of thinking power. Now, you might think, wow, I'm bad at remembering things, so that is hard for me. We're talking about the kind of mental task. The memorization is short term. Learn it, keep it, get rid of it, and then you don't basically remember it after that. And that would be purely if we said identify these things. Now, if I also said, hey, in addition to just showing me that you know what a yield sign looks like, I'm going to ask you to explain to me what yield means and show an understanding of the concept of yielding. That requires more thought. So that's a step up. You've got to remember it and you've got to demonstrate or show me your understanding in writing, perhaps. If I said, okay, in addition to just recognizing the yield sign and explaining the yield sign, I'm also going to include a couple of scenarios on the test where cars are put into situations, and I want you to apply the concept of yield to this situation. Again, sounds a little bit more challenging, and that's exactly what's going on. Is application of your understanding requires, more mental power. If I said, and the ones that we're going to use for application are kind of like the ones we've talked about in class. However, I'm going to have some new situations that you've never seen before and you haven't encountered in our class. But if you understand the concept of yield and you can apply it, then these will require some critical thinking skills. You'll utilize your lower level skills. It's a new scenario you haven't seen, and I'm going to ask you to analyze maybe why the driver made the choice that the driver made. So you can see another level of difficulty. If I said, now the last portion of the test, I'm going to give you 2 different drivers that have made choices concerning yielding, and I want you to evaluate which driver has made the safest choice of the 2. Now, for this to be a real evaluation task, the 2 drivers would have to be pretty similar, right? If one of them is like going 100 miles an hour through the yield and not stopping, that's not going to be tricky for the students. Not tricky. It won't be challenging for them to figure out. An evaluation task should really ask kids to use their critical thinking skills in ways that stretch them. Then I might say, as a bonus question, I'm going to ask you to create your own scenario that's not like any of the ones we've had before, in which a driver must use yield. Or I might say, here, given these parameters, I want you to create a yield scenario. The key is that the 6th level or top level, it would need to be more challenging thinking. So Bloom knew that some of the things we ask students to do are easier than other things that we ask them to do. And the challenge for you as a teacher is to make sure that you are not only teaching kids at their remember level or understand. My son had a social studies class this year, and pretty much this class was a remember understand class. You took notes, you got a study guide that you filled out that had lots of blanks, you memorized that for the test. The test was exactly the same as the study guide. It was just maybe instead of fill in the blank, it was multiple choice. But you just had to remember the facts. There were very few short answer or essay kinds of questions at all, which might test some understanding. It was purely remember and understand. No application, no analysis, none of this. And as a teacher, you don't want to stay at the bottom levels. You want to challenge yourself to plan lessons that move students up the ladder. You can't always do everything in one lesson. That's why we'll refer to a unit of teaching as versus a lesson. A lesson is one day. A unit might be a week, where Monday through Friday, you're teaching a concept, and Monday pretty much you're here and here. Tuesday, you move here. Wednesday, they're ready for this level. Thursday and Friday, you're spent doing these 2 levels. But over that week, the kids have really studied this concept in depth, and they have practiced all of these different levels of thinking, and they're feeling very, very challenged at the end of the week. And then your exam that you give them could test them on all of the levels perhaps. Or maybe it's a project instead of an exam. It doesn't have to be a test. And the project, when they do the project, if they do it well, it will show their ability on all of these levels. Something else that you can find online that I found is this list of Bloom's taxonomy action verbs. And since we're talking about choosing verbs that are measurable, this little sheet is a good way to help you find the verbs that are measurable. I'll put this on Blackboard for you so that you can print all these things out. But again, from remembering up to creating, these are the verbs. I'll warn you, some of these verbs are not clearly measurable, but they do fit in each of the Bloom's categories. If you look through these lists, you can see some of the more measurable verbs immediately. Defining, labeling, listing, naming. Comparing and contrasting is pretty measurable. Demonstrate is not. Explain is measurable. Illustrate can be measurable if you literally mean that they're going to draw something out. Apply can be measurable depending on the situation. Choose, construct if they're literally constructing something. Identify, again, select. So although some of these verbs are used in multiple lists, as you move across the list, then the verbs become more challenging. But I will just warn you, this is not a list of measurable verbs. It's just a list of taxonomy action verbs. I would suggest for your very first lesson that you stick to clearly measurable verbs. Identify, explain, define, maybe compare and contrast, things like that. It could be that your frameworks have the great measurable verb in them, or they might not, and you might have to create it when you write your objective. And then this is a slide that just talks about a lesson versus a unit and how you can use Bloom's taxonomy to help you create a series of linked objectives that teach something in depth. And this is pretty much what we talked about already. Now we're going to practice picking out goals versus activities. Now, and I'm using a couple of words interchangeably, so let me make sure that, when I say the word goal, I also mean the objective of the lesson, the one that you write that goes in, the box that you share with students. So objectives, goals, outcomes all mean the same thing. The idea here is it is very tricky sometimes when you're new at lesson planning to make sure that you are actually writing a student learning goal versus writing an activity statement. So the goal is, of course, what you want the students to learn, and the activity is what you want the students to do during the lesson. So I'm going to end this video here, and I'll start a new one, and we'll break down goal versus activity.